Holmesburg Prison Experiment. This is a human experiment at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. From 1951 to 1974, this place was a hotbed of some seriously questionable scientific activities. Post-World War II, with the pharmaceutical industry booming and ethics apparently on vacation, the stage was set for crazy experiments and medical research. Now, I know what you're thinking. Didn't the Nuremberg Code of 1947 outright ban such human experiments? Well, American researchers seem to think that code was more of a suggestion than a rule, especially if it meant keeping up with the Soviets during the Cold War. Try this pill. It might cure something or give you superpowers, seemed to be the guiding principle. At Holmesburg, the range of experiments was damning. Prisoners had everything from cosmetics to keep them looking fresh to corrosive chemicals, not so fresh, tested on them. These studies were bankrolled by some big names like Johnson & Johnson, Dow Chemical Company, and even the US Army. Just your average corporate side hustle. The experiments were labeled voluntary, with prisoners receiving a few dollars for their participation. But when you're in a situation where a couple of bucks can mean the world, how voluntary is voluntary? Here's your $2. See you tomorrow for another round of who knows what. Dr. Albert Kligman is a dermatologist whose first impression of Holmesburg's inmates was seeing them as acres of skin. He viewed the prisoners as nothing more than a field ripe for harvesting data. The experiments conducted under his watch included exposure to STDs, skin-blistering agents, radiation, psychoactive drugs, and cancer-causing substances. One infamous experiment involved dioxins, which later played a role in the formulation of Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. As scary as it gets, prisoners were essentially treated like lab rats, queued up daily to see what new test they'd be subjected to for a quick buck. $5 to test something that might knock you out cold? Sure, why not? Was the prevailing attitude among the desperate inmates. One prisoner recounted being cut open, stuffed with gauze, and then stitched back up, only to have it removed 10 days later for a $10 bill. No explanation, no follow-up, just a transaction. By the 1970s, it was estimated that over 90% of Holmesburg's inmates had been involved in these trials. Only then did society begin to think, maybe, just maybe, this isn't the right way to go about scientific discovery. Josef Mengele Experiment. Josef Mengele's experiments during World War II stand out as particularly horrific. Mengele was a German SS officer and physician stationed at the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp in Poland. While SS doctors generally didn't provide direct care to the suffering prisoners, Mengele saw the camp as a vast pool of subjects for his research. His main job was to determine which prisoners could return to work and which would be sent to the gas chambers. However, it was his deep dive into depraved scientific curiosity that marked him as a figure of pure evil. Mengele was particularly fascinated by rare genetic anomalies such as heterochromia, dwarfism, and especially identical twins. He managed to handpick over 1,500 individuals, mostly children, saving them from immediate death in exchange for becoming his test subjects. These children received better food and housing than others, but the cost was unimaginable horror. An inmate doctor once noted how Mengele could be paradoxically kind to these children, giving them sweets and attention one minute, then coldly sending them to their deaths the next. His experiments were nightmares of medical science. He might amputate healthy limbs, inject diseases, perform transfusions, or remove organs, all without anesthesia. One of his more brutal acts was attempting to change eye color by injecting chemicals directly into children's eyeballs, sometimes removing the eyes to pin them to his office wall. After the experiments, which often resulted in death or mutilation, Mengele would end the life of the surviving twin to compare the autopsy results. Out of the 1,500 victims, only about 200 survived. Despite the vast scale of these crimes, Many, like Mengele, evaded justice after the war. He fled to Argentina and lived until 1979, joining his ancestors not from the hands of justice, but accidentally while swimming in the ocean. Vipeholm Experiment. Back in the 1930s, Sweden had a real sweet tooth saga. Candy was all the rage. Everyone from toddlers to grandpas were indulging in sugary delights daily. At the same time, dentists were busy, dealing with a surge of cavities and tooth decay. Believe it or not, 83% of children were sporting cavities, because back then, dental hygiene was less science and more guesswork. As tooth troubles ticked up, the Swedish government decided it was high time to take a closer look at tooth care. Initially, fingers were pointed at candy makers, but of course, they rejected the accusations with, "Who, us, couldn't be." With no concrete evidence to pin the blame, Swedish medical experts initiated the Vipeholm study to dig into the sugar dental decay problem. Finding volunteers for a study that might wreck their teeth wasn't exactly an easy sell. If someone approached you with a charming offer to munch sweets until your teeth turned to dust, you'd likely take a hard pass. That's exactly what most sane adults did. Undeterred, in 1945, the study kicked off with funding from both the government and those suspected candy companies. The chosen venue was the Vipeholm Institution for the Intellectually Disabled, but back then, it was all systems go for the sake of science. The study roped in 660 patients who, from 1945 to 1947, were put on a regimen of vitamins, fluoride, and starch-light meals without any snacks in between. By the end of this phase, 73% showed no new dental issues. Vitamins and fluoride got a clear nod of approval. However, the script flipped in 1947 when the menu changed to a sugar diet, including snacks, drinks, and a particularly nasty toffee designed to cling to teeth like a bad reputation. Fast forward to 1949, and about 10% of the participants' teeth were in serious condition, affected with cavities and causing daily agony. If you've ever had a toothache, you can imagine the level of discomfort. However, the candy billionaires weren't thrilled with these revelations and sat on the results, delaying their publication until 1953, which caused public outrage. Interestingly, the uproar was more about the damning evidence against sugar than the ethically dubious methods of the study. At the time, the use of intellectually disabled individuals was seen as a necessary trade-off. Their participation was viewed as their contribution to society. It wasn't until the 1990s that people began to question the ethics of the Vipeholm experiments. The Monster Study Experiment. Despite what the name might suggest, this wasn't a research project on actual monsters, but the methodology might make you think the designer had a monstrous side. This study was the work of Wendell Johnson, an American psychologist based at the University of Iowa. He embarked on this research to explore if positive reinforcement could cure a severe stutter in children. Sounds noble, right? The study also aimed to see if it was possible to induce a stutter in children through verbal mistreatment. Suddenly, the study takes a darker turn. The guinea pigs for this psychological study were orphans. 22 orphans, aged between 5 and 15, were added to this experiment. They were split into groups based on their speech capabilities. Some were stutterers, and some were fluent speakers. The structure of the study was as follows. 4 groups were formed. Group 1A consisted of 6 children without stutters who received praise for their fluent speech. Group 2A also comprised 6 fluent speakers, but they were falsely told they were starting to stutter and needed to pull their socks up. Group 1B included 5 children who did stutter. They were comfortingly told that their stutter was just a phase. Lastly, Group 2B, also stutterers, were repeatedly criticized for their speech impediments. The heart of the study lay in Groups 2A and 1B, which were expected to provide the most insight into Johnson's hypotheses about inducing and curing stutters. The experiments, though conceived by Johnson, were carried out by a graduate student, Mary Tudor. She followed a script crafted by Johnson, documenting the children's reactions and progress. Group 1B, the stutterers receiving positive reinforcement, were told they'd eventually outgrow their stutter. Flip the script to Group 2A, the non-stutterers under psychological assault. They were told their speech was deteriorating, complaints were pouring in, and they better fix their speech or zip it. Imagine the stress on these young minds, being hammered with criticism out of the blue. Teachers at the orphanage were also in on the act, reinforcing the distressing messages to ensure the experiment's immersive environment. Over the 5-month study period, the impact on Group 2A was immediate and distressing. Kids who had been chatty and confident became withdrawn, scared to utter more than a few words, turning a simple conversation into an awkward exchange you'd expect on a particularly bad date. One 12-year-old girl even fled the orphanage. By the study's end, although none of the Group 2A children developed a stutter, the psychological scars were evident. Their confidence in speaking was shattered, an effect that lingered throughout their lives. So, what did we learn? Can you cure a stutter with kindness? Apparently not. Can you induce a stutter through cruelty? No, but you can inflict deep psychological wounds.